Welcome to Trench Diaries and welcome to another story. If you are a returning viewer, welcome back. If you are new to this channel, this is Trench Diaries, where I present stories from people of all walks of life and their experiences during the darkest hours of human history. These stories are told from the point of view of Luftwaffe pilots, naval officers as well as infantry personnel. I also add a bit of personal research and experience after each episode, since I have served in the German army myself and am a captain of the reserve. Today I present you something new, in fact one of my favorite books of all time, Sniper on the Eastern Front, the story of Josef Allerberger, who started the war as a machine gunner but soon started to experiment with a captured Soviet Mosin Nagant sniper rifle. He then became one of the most successful German snipers of the Second World War. This is his story. But before we begin, be advised, this book covers infantry combat on the Eastern Front and as such depicts some of the worst things that humans can do to each other. It's quite visceral at times, so don't say I didn't warn you. Now, grab a drink of your choice, sit back, relax and enjoy his tale. I am your host Jay, roll the intro. Prologue. With the fall of Stalingrad, there began a 2-year retreat that drew the soldiers of both sides into a vortex of inhuman strain and conflict. During these 2 years, the Eastern Front became symbolic of the German soldier's nature and the scene of uncounted human tragedies. A great deal has been written about this war, analyzing, examining and reporting. But finding suitable words to describe the indescribable, the daily struggle for survival, the horror and the fear is hardly possible, and if one is to succeed at all in conveying any of this, it is only achieved by concentrating on the fate of a single individual. In addition, it is hard to steer a course between the rational, distanced language and contemplation of a military historian and the sympathetic approach of a biographer interested in the human dimensions of this subject. At this book's heart stands the so-called sniper, exemplary of a type of soldier who, regarded with a mixture of admiration and abhorrence, is often overlooked and forgotten amid the historiography of war, yet who achieved outstanding feats and often saved the lives of many of their comrades by their courage and personal bravery, by taking an enemy's life with a precision that was sometimes terrifying. Like few other soldiers after the war, they had to live with the knowledge of having extinguished so many lives, not anonymously but at a personal, one-to-one level, looking straight into the eye of their opponents. Nearly all of them shut this knowledge up within themselves for the rest of their lives. Hardly any of them are prepared to talk about their experiences. After 50 years, one of the best has broken his silence and, in long conversations with his biographer, has told his own story of the war. As a memento of a specialized facet of military service, it provides a reminder of the real face of war, of how it looks to an infantry soldier fighting at the front. After the passage of so many years, it is inevitable that many of his memories had become blurred and that only his most traumatic experiences had remained crystal clear in his mind, and the biographer was left to join up these pieces of information and to sort them into a coherent and readable narrative. Doing so, it was essential to fill the gaps in his story through thorough research to complement and to complete it. One other problem revealed itself to the biographer as he worked, which is expressed perfectly in the German saying that he who wins is right, but he who loses is wrong. While Russian and Allied marksmen are honored as heroes, German marksmen, even in their own country, are considered as wicked killers. Because of this, it has proved necessary to protect the subject of the study by keeping his identity anonymous. Many of the names in this book are likewise fictitious, but the story is real. The subject of this book we will call Sepp Allerberger. Sepp Allerberger was a journeyman carpenter from a little village near Salzburg who was drawn into the growing vortex of events on the Eastern Front in the first days of July of 1943. Thereafter, until the end of the war in May of 1945, his life would center around his comrades of the 2nd Battalion, Gebirgsjäger Regiment 144 of 3 Gebirgsjäger Division. The soldiers of this formation came mainly from the Alpine region. This ethnic unity was doubtless one of the main reasons for its high morale, as demonstrated throughout the story. An Arctic winter had struck the soldiers of the Eastern Front with its icy hand. Cold, physically emaciated and without hope, tens of thousands of men of the German 6th Army in Stalingrad had been sacrificed, for reasons which remain dubious to this day. The fall of this city marked the obvious turning point in the fate of the Wehrmacht, which had been largely successful until then. The offensive that had led to this catastrophe was executed with energy but insufficient planning, and the conflict would now turn irrevocably into a defensive war that would end in utter chaos, with the red flag of the Soviet army flying from the roof of the Reichstag as a foretaste of the coming 50-year partition of the nation. Germany would experience its own Judgment Day amid the ruins of its cities and cultural assets. The 3rd Gebirgsjäger Division, which will be the focus of this work, was fighting south of Stalingrad in the winter of 1942 to 1943. With the annihilation of the 6th Army, it found itself caught up in the ensuing Russian winter offensive. Confronted by numerically superior forces, it was only by a supreme effort and after suffering indescribable losses in men and material that the division managed to escape encirclement and thereby avoid the fate of its comrades in Stalingrad. After a murderous winter fight in the basin of Milerovo and the breakout to link up with the new defensive line in Voroshilovsk, Gebirgsjäger Regiment 144 was reduced to a quarter of its regular fighting strength. Near Voroshilovsk, the regiment took a firm stand, and it was built back up to strength with new recruits and equipment over the following 6 months. Compared to the battles it had gone through during the winter, the 144th had to deal with no more than light skirmishes and decoy attacks here. Apart from these, its war became one of combat patrols, occasionally artillery barrages, and the constant threat of Russian snipers, whose victims were found mostly among the regiment's new and inexperienced recruits. Because of their lack of heavy infantry weapons, the Germans were more or less helpless in the face of this phenomenon. Only in a handful of cases were they able to locate the position of a Russian sniper and shoot at him with medium infantry weapons such as mortars, machine guns, and light pack guns. It was obvious that they were in need of marksmen of their own. Chapter 1. The End of Human Innocence. A shining summer morning on the Eastern Front is just warming up. The dampness of the night gives a spicy scent of earth and grass to the warming air. But he doesn't pay any attention to nature. He cannot let it distract him now. All his senses are tensed. He resembles a predator searching for prey. Looking through the binoculars, he scans the approaches of the Russian front line again. Somewhere out there was his enemy's perfectly disguised position, the Russian sniper who'd killed 9 comrades in the last few days. He had to be an expert, because Sepp had already been searching in vain for this position for 2 days. But when the marksman's bullet had hit the 9th rifleman in the early hours of the morning, Sepp believed he'd been able to distinguish the approximate direction from which the shot had come. There, finally, a revealing sign. Tufts of grass standing somehow strangely below the edge of a bush. His gaze concentrated piercingly on the suspicious spot. Yes, that was exactly where he was. The adrenaline coursed through Sepp as he recognized shadowy parts of a telescopic sight and the weapon's muzzle as it suddenly flashed. With a crashing bang, he could see the projectile racing towards him. As if paralyzed, he lay there unable to escape. With a damp shock, the missile hit the middle of his forehead, and his head and thoughts exploded in a flash of light. At that very moment, Sepp wakes up from a deep dream. His heart is pounding up into his throat, and it feels like minutes before he can drag himself back from 1944 to the reality of the present day. Slowly, he pulls himself together, but he doesn't even think of sleep anymore. Through the open window of his bedroom come the muffled sounds of night and the lovely fresh air of early summer. He stands up and goes to the window. He sucks the night air deep into his tight chest. After a few breaths, his gaze settles on the silhouette of the Salzburger Alps, above which a beautiful moon is hanging. Just as clear as the moon had hung above the Russian steppe in late summer, as a tiny train with supplies for the front roared across the huge expanse. He remembered sitting in the open door of the carriage, his thoughts full of tense impatience for his coming soldier's life. We were poor, thoughtless small fry, he reflects, and his thoughts began wandering. And as they had many times before over the years, episodes of his wartime life involuntarily wander through his mind. Some of the events that occurred more than 50 years ago are as fresh as they were yesterday. Born the son of a carpenter in September of 1924, Sepp grew up in the surroundings of a village in the Salzburger Land. He spent a carefree youth guided by conservative values such as patriotism, diligence, discharge of duty, and obedience to social authorities. It was his firm anchoring in these ethical values that enabled him to accept his coming fate with such fatalism. He naturally followed in his father's footsteps and learned the carpenter's trade in preparation for taking over the family business one day. The prospect of military service he regarded as a duty and an honor at the same time, as soldiers enjoyed considerable respect in the community. Conscription was an exciting experience for young men, providing them with new self-esteem and the sense of having achieved adulthood. Sepp was a product of the social and political conditions of his time. His childhood was influenced and controlled by the dirigism and strong ideological policies of the Third Reich, which was practiced at linking national self-consciousness and conservative virtues with unquestioning readiness for duty, especially among the young, in order to implement its political aims. It was natural for young men of Sepp's age to report to the Wehrmacht voluntarily, to fulfill the aspirations of their government by force of arms. After almost 3 years of war, with the Wehrmacht marching from one victorious campaign to the next, many young men were almost afraid of missing their chance to participate in the fighting, because according to the omnipresent propaganda machine, final victory was now in sight. Distanced from the bitter and merciless reality of war, the day when they were declared fit for military service in the autumn of 1942 was one of honor for the village's young men. The mayor gave a short speech about service to the fatherland and the heroic struggle against Bolshevism. The fire brigade orchestra serenaded them merrily, and some girls of the Bund Deutscher Mädel, which was the League of German Maidens, pinned little bouquets to the lapels of the future heroes. The thought of possible death or mutilation didn't occur to anyone, but 6 of the young men who proudly posed for a group portrait would not survive the next 2 years. A few months later, they reported for duty, filled with high hopes. After finishing his apprenticeship aged 18 in February of 1943, Sepp, like nearly all of the young men from his region, was called up to serve in the Gebirgsjäger mountain troops based at Kufstein in the Tyrol. After being kitted out, he and his comrades were transferred to Mittenwald for their infantry basic training 10 days later. After 6 months of being driven hard, Sepp was a machine gunner. During the whole of his training period, the topic of snipers as a tactical aspect of infantry combat was not mentioned at all. There were just some derogatory remarks about Russian snipers and women with shotguns who were to be fought by the machine gunners vigorously and relentlessly. The training was hard, but without the harassment evident in the peacetime army or in the early stages of the war. Instead, it concentrated on preparing the young men, at least physically, for the hardship they would face in the field and on familiarizing them with their weapons. In particular, the instructors who had experience of fighting at the front tried to pass on their knowledge. They knew about the dramatically high losses suffered among new soldiers sent to the front as replacements who were overwhelmed by the horrifying reality of war. Exposed suddenly to the merciless brutality of combat, many were seized with primeval panic and an uncontrolled desire to flee. But, though this behavior might have saved them in olden times, in an age of sophisticated weapons of war capable of killing over great distances, it led to their downfall. Careful training could prepare an individual for the moment of confrontation, but it could do little to help control the natural instinct to run away from danger. In the last resort, everybody has to decide for himself, and then, not until that moment of conflict actually arrives, if he can look calmly into war's countenance or not. It is at that moment that the warrior emerges, to whom fighting is second nature and the battlefield is home, but who is forever confronted by the eternal quandary of kill or be killed. Only from such a forge of warlike reality does a sniper emerge, a soldier who knows how to keep his mind clear, who is able to act in the front line in the heat of battle, and who knows how to apply his weapon, the rifle with its telescopic sight, to optimum effect. Only these soldiers deserve the name marksman. At the beginning of September of 1942, Sepp and his comrades got their marching orders to join Gebirgsjäger Regiment 144, which was still in the southern part of the Eastern Front near Voroshilovsk. They were among the final batch of replacements sent to bring the regiment up to its full fighting strength. But before this, they received a 3-day pass, though the 3 days passed like the batting of an eyelid. For most of them, it was the last opportunity in their young lives to see their families and to say farewell. The uncertainty of his future was indescribable, but Sepp's mother stroked his head at every opportunity and tried to caress him. His father, a soldier in the First World War, hid his concern in silence and hard work. The inescapable day of separation arrived. When Sepp got on the bus that would take him back to the barracks at Mittenwald, his mother was all tears. His father embraced him when saying goodbye, which he didn't normally do, and, obviously trying to maintain his composure, whispered into his ear, "Take care of yourself, boy. It is my dearest wish that you return unharmed, but it is now in God's hands." When the bus started, Sepp waved briefly just once, and then faced forward suddenly with a fixed expression. Otherwise, he would have lost the composure that he had only managed to maintain with difficulty. It was anxiously observed that in the area of the Gebirgsjäger division, the Red Army was preparing for a major offensive to the Donetsk Becken, which is the Donetsk Basin, and the Ukraine, strengthened by the arrival of supplies of new American weapons. Every man who increased the fighting strength of the German units was therefore highly welcome. Sepp and his companions traveled across the infinite Russian steppe for days in straw-strewn cattle wagons before they reached their destination, the Donetsk Becken. Their arrival in Voroshilovsk coincided with the very beginning of the Russian attack, and without any chance of becoming acclimatized to life at the front, the day after their arrival they were thrown into the battle for the Red Kina Schlucht, which was extraordinarily hard and resulted in many losses. In the opinion of the average Lancer or common soldier, Sepp had a really hard lot, because the 3rd Gebirgsjäger Division would serve in an atypical, purely infantry role in the southern sector of the Eastern Front for the rest of the war, always at the heart of the fighting. The unit's losses were consequently enormous and proportionately far higher than in the rest of the army. With its extensive coal mines, the Donetsk Becken was an important source of raw materials, so it was of the highest importance to both parties. The mines, with their huge tunnel systems, had not been entirely cleared of enemy troops when the Germans advanced. Entire Russian units just let the Wehrmacht roll past them as they hid in the tunnels and then emerged in the midst of the surprised Lancers. As a result, there were murderous close-quarter combats that extended even into the tunnel system itself. The Soviets had already broken through the German lines in an energetic attack before Sepp reached the front, and now they tried to extend this bridgehead. The commander of the 3rd Gebirgsjäger Division estimated the situation as very precarious, so he made a counterstrike without any further preparations or regrouping of his forces. This succeeded, but it was a victory bought by huge losses among the Lancers. It was at daybreak on July the 18th of 1943 that Sepp and his fellow riflemen finally arrived and went quietly to their quarters. Their thoughts were turned inwards and worry and nervousness were written on their faces. Everyone had his own method of coping with the fear that came before deployment. The experienced men were chewing crusts of bread with a dark expression on their faces, or were smoking, or just pulled themselves together with expressionless faces. The newer ones had huge difficulty controlling their nervousness. They were uneasy, restless, twitchy. Many were puking, and they crabbed and pissed continually. Lacking any experience of what was about to come, Sepp took the strange scene in with a distinct sense of dread. He was unable to eat, his stomach was about to rebel, and his body felt like jelly. He felt as if he couldn't move. In this critical situation, he was lucky because his section leader was very experienced and, despite being battle-hardened, remained sensitive to the needs of the new men in his unit. He recognized Sepp's fear and talked to him reassuringly. "Breathe deeply, man. Just think of your machine gun and shoot like you've learned to. Pay attention to me and to my orders. I take care of my boys, and if it's really hard, I'm with you. Up to now, I've brought my unit out of every mess, and nobody will be left behind." A mixture of juvenile naivety and trust in the character of his group leader gave Sepp the necessary strength to overcome his anxiety and confront the events that would accompany his baptism of fire. It was almost 5 a.m. when the attack began with a barrage of artillery fire from their rear. With dull thuds, the earth was torn apart in front of the riflemen, and soil was blown into the clear morning sky in huge fountains. The totally new sounds felt uncomfortable in Sepp's ears, where they mixed with the roar of bullet impacts and the high buzz of pieces of shrapnel. He and the other riflemen crouched in their positions and waited for the order to attack. After about 20 minutes, the artillery fire broke off, and suddenly Sepp recognized an unusual sound. It was the animal sound of wounded Russians. The order to attack came amid the horror that was beginning to grow inside him. All the tension and nervousness was suddenly released into movement. Like a vortex, the violent commencement of the battle dragged the Lancers away with it. Suddenly, Russian grenades were exploding in the riflemen's lines, and as Sepp jumped up, there was a buzzing, tearing sound. To his right, a comrade, a young guy of his own age from Berchtesgaden, was staring incredulously at his torn uniform jacket, from which his intestines were pouring out, more and more of them with every movement. After a few seconds of shock, he started to scream tremendously and tried to stuff the steaming intestines back inside. Sepp wanted to help him, and he put down his MG, but his section leader hit him on the back and screamed, "Come on, attack! Nobody can help him, give covering fire to your comrades!" As Sepp broke free of his paralysis, the wounded man suddenly went silent and, with a mystified look in his eyes, sank to his knees and tipped over face down on the earth. Sepp, who was already 20 meters away, did not see the releasing death of his comrade. His thoughts were wiped away, and he was seized by a primitive will to survive. death, injury, and fear were meaningless. His entire existence was reduced to shooting, loading, jumping forward, looking for cover, and peering about for the enemy, his target, like an animal. An alteration was taking place within him. In the ensuing hours of vehemently raging conflict, the naive young man turned into a lancer, a warrior in the original meaning of the word. The mixture of fear, blood, and death was like a drug which was on the one hand intoxicating but on the other depressing, because it not only marked the end of human innocence but also swept away the future and the expectation of a future life. Killing became a trait forced on him, and his fate wanted him to perfect it to mastery. Sepp's group worked its way carefully through the bushes until it was suddenly ambushed from a distance of about 20 meters. A rifleman fell without a word in the hail of bullets from a volley of automatic weapons fire. Sepp returned fire instantly, while the unhurt rifleman sought cover. Then they threw hand grenades toward the enemy position and advanced, giving covering fire to each other only to find that the enemy had suddenly disappeared. Pushing forward into the group of bushes, they found 4 dead Russians in front of a masterfully disguised mine entrance. The dead bodies looked totally emaciated and cadaverous. Probably they had been holding out in the tunnel for months. There were fresh tracks leading back into the mine. A mixture of curiosity and fascination compelled some of the riflemen to go in, their weapons held ready in firing position. A few minutes after the earth had swallowed them up, Sepp heard the dull sound of shots deep inside. Shortly after, the riflemen staggered back into the daylight, deathly pale and obviously quite confused. There was no time to ask questions because a Russian company was now attacking the sector, and the swirl of battle drew the riflemen away. The relentless struggle lasted until dusk at about 10 p.m. It was a wonder to Sepp that he had survived this day in contrast to many of his comrades. Now his company was pulled back to the start line from which the morning's attack had commenced. Because of the underestimated resistance put up by the Russians, the attack would have to be mounted anew the next day, and both sides took the opportunity to regroup. This pause in the fighting was used to see to the smaller injuries of those who remained fit for action and to bring up supplies of food and ammunition. Sitting with a crust of bread, a can of fish and a cigarette, they talked about the most significant events of the day. This was the first opportunity for Sepp to ask his surviving comrades what had happened in the tunnel. In short sentences, still clearly shocked by the unexpected horror of what they had seen, 2 of the surviving riflemen described an incredible event of the sort that seemed to happen every day during this war. Groping their way forward in the pale light of the tunnel after about 50 meters, the men had found a meagerly lit cave that stank unbearably. It took them a few moments to adjust to the darkness before the horror became visible. In a corner, 2 Russians were squatting alongside each other. Close by were the remains of 2 carefully preserved human bodies lying on ammunition boxes. They had obviously been smoked above the fire in order to preserve them. Next to a pile of excrement in another corner were the intestines, which were starting to decay, and gnawed bones. Shaking with disgust, one of the riflemen who was able to speak a little Russian asked the 2 survivors what had happened. They reported that they had been left with 35 men in this tunnel when the Russians withdrew, with strict orders to stay in hiding and hold their position until their army counterattacked. This counterattack didn't come for months, so very soon all their supplies were used up. Their political officer nevertheless ensured that they complied with their orders, and when many of the soldiers demanded that they should withdraw, he killed the 2 youngest, they were just 16 years old, as a deterrent. He shot them in the neck in cold blood and then ordered the other soldiers at gunpoint to gut them, carve them out, and smoke their body parts over the fire. He forced the soldiers to divide the corpses' livers and to eat them fresh. For the next few weeks they lived on the offender's flesh. They did not even think of rebelling against their political officer because their sergeant and the other 2 NCOs sided with him and secured all their weapons in boxes. Before long the bodies were eaten, and the officer then shot the next youngest soldier without mercy. A few days after that, the Russian attack finally retook the tunnel, and this obliged the group to come out. While the rifleman translated this report, one of the other German soldiers started to puke, overwhelmed by disgust. Once he could breathe again, he shouted, "You revolting assholes!" and fired his MP40. In disbelief, their eyes full of panic, the 2 Russians stared at the impacts on their bodies while foaming blood came from their chapped, speechless lips. "Get out of here, boys," shouted the section leader, and they hurried out, leaving the nightmarish scene behind them. They sucked in mouthfuls of fresh air greedily. To the experienced lancers, this was just an incident of war, but Sepp was overwhelmed by a flood of extreme emotions, gaining insight to the unplumbed depths of human experience. Yet, this was no more than an almost innocuous introduction to war's depravity compared to what would follow. But this was no time for profound thoughts. Sleep and hunger were demanding attention, and there were just a few hours of rest left. In the end, it took 4 days before the Soviet resistance could be broken with the support of additional artillery and assault weapons. This tongue of conquered Russian soil was bought with the lives of 650 German lives. At the end of the 5 days, Sepp had lost even the last shreds of his juvenile naivety. The experience of these murderous battles had already etched the lines into his face, making him look 10 years older. His company, the 7th, had been reduced to just 20 men. Of his own squad, only he and his section leader were left. Sepp had lost all sensation of time, fear, and compassion. He was a product of the events around them, driven by the primitive instinct to survive the demands of combat, hunger, thirst, and exhaustion. And there we go. The first chapter of this new book is done. Again, if you are new to Trench Diaries, the audio cue you've just heard indicates the end of the material and the beginning of what I call the after-action report. Here, I talk about interesting things that happened in the episode or share some personal experiences that I've had in relation to the things described in the story. As for Sepp, he was trained in mountain warfare as a Gebirgsjäger, which simply translates to light infantry, mountain. Now, mountain troops have a special reputation within the army, and I can attest to the fact that they are indeed very special, because I myself underwent basic training in a mountain battalion, even though it was an armored reconnaissance battalion and as such mechanized. But since you can't drive a recon vehicle up a mountainside, our training was very infantry heavy and I wore the Edelweiss with pride. I also did not understand a single spoken word during the first few weeks, since the battalion was in the deep German south and myself, being from the east, was quite unfamiliar with the very thick Bavarian dialect. In any case, the first chapter starts off strong with the story of cannibalism, but I can assure you it will get worse. I hope you'll stay with me and hope to see you in the next episode. Until then, consider subscribing and commenting. I read every single one. Cheers.